This video was brought to you by Ground News. Inflation is currently the core problem facing the British economy, and it's supposed to be up to the UK's central bank, the Bank of England, to tackle it. Unfortunately for ordinary Brits though, and for the bank, inflation isn't coming down, in spite of the Bank of England hiking its base rate to its highest level since 2008. This, combined with misplaced comments by bank officials, has led to public satisfaction with the bank falling to its lowest level on record. So in this video, we're going to take a look at the history of central bank independence, why people are so grumpy at the Bank of England, and whether it could really be brought back under government control. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. To properly understand the debate over the Bank of England, we need to very quickly run through the theory of having an independent central bank. Essentially, governments around the world have two levers at their disposal when it comes to economic policy: fiscal policy and monetary policy. Fiscal policy relates to tax and spend. Decisions on whether to increase income tax or spending on education, for instance. While monetary policy, on the other hand, relates to the quantity and price of money, i.e. interest rates. Now, politicians may claim to be focused on the general good, but in reality there tends to be one main thing on their mind: re-election. And what's one way to win an election? Command a booming economy with as low unemployment rate as possible. So when politicians have control over both leaders, something known as political business cycles develop. In the run to an election, the incumbent government lowers interest rates to cause an economic boom. If they end up losing, then, well, it's their opponent's problem to deal with now. And if they win, well, they've just won, and they can begin to slowly increase interest rates to pour cold water on an overheating economy and get inflation back under control. Now, empirical evidence for this theory of political business cycles is spotty at best, but the key takeaway is that there's a disconnect between the benefits and the costs. The benefits, growth and employment, are short term. The costs, inflation, are only really felt in the medium to long term. Over time, this leads inflation to being higher than is optimal, a phenomenon known as inflationary bias. The idea is, though, that by giving central banks independence, this protects against running the economy unnecessarily hot, because central bankers aren't seeking re-election every 4 or 5 years. So their incentives aren't skewed. Their tenure in office is relatively fixed, allowing them to make the hard decisions and take a longer-term view. And so, in 1997, in one of the very first actions of the new Labour government, and in a surprise to many, Gordon Brown, the then Chancellor, gave the Bank of England operational independence. Announcing the move, Brown stressed that he wanted to set in place a long-term framework for economic prosperity and break the boom and bust economics of previous years. Following this, the bank, as is the case with central banks globally, was given two mandates: a core and primary mandate to keep inflation on target, and a secondary mandate to keep the economy at so-called full employment. Now, we don't have time to get into the actual economics here, but the key takeaway here is that these two mandates are in conflict. Low unemployment tends to be associated with higher inflation, and vice versa, a relationship known as the Phillips curve. Now, the Bank of England sets the interest rate to try and reconcile these two mandates, to essentially strike a balance between inflation and unemployment. The problem here is that such a decision is inherently political. The pace of inflation reduction is an inherently political decision with distributional consequences, because unemployment affects the poorest worst, and high interest rates benefit people with lots of money in the first place. So, in the eyes of many, what the Bank of England is trying to do right now is to overcompensate for its initial failure to tackle inflation, and in doing so is blindly trying to push down inflation with scant regard for its impacts on people's mortgages and livelihoods. The bank hasn't helped itself in this regard either, and senior officials have made some incredibly ill-advised comments. For example, the bank's chief economist, Hugh Pill, came under fire for saying that Brits need to accept that they are poorer and should stop seeking pay increases. And Andrew Bailey himself suggested that workers should show, quote, quite clear restraint in pay negotiations. A comment which was made extremely awkward given that Bailey was paid over £575,000 in his first year as governor, and Brits have suffered essentially a decade of stagnant wage growth already. Now, to be fair, the Bank of England is not alone in struggling with inflation. Central banks around the world are struggling to bring inflation down, and it's not even clear that a more forceful monetary policy a year ago would have been able to keep inflation on target anyway, given how much of today's inflation was caused by global factors like Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Nonetheless, with the bank's popularity waning and further unpopular rate hikes to come, some people have floated the idea of bringing the bank back under government control. Liz Truss, for example, considered reviewing the bank's mandate during her leadership election. And while Sunak is staunchly in favour of the bank's independence, his stated goal to halve inflation by the end of the year tacitly admits that inflation has become a political issue, not just a technocratic one. So, was it a mistake to give the Bank of England operational independence in the first place? Well, the current consensus is no. At the time, the European Central Bank was being created on a super independent model, and the Fed was also independent, so it would have been a difficult position to sustain for long. And beyond mere optics, most academic literature agrees that independent central banks do a better job of containing inflation in advanced economies than politicians do. Nonetheless, even if rescinding its independence isn't a good idea, the current system is clearly flawed. Even Andrew Bailey has admitted that there are obviously lessons to be learned. What's perhaps more interesting, though, is not whether, but how an independent Bank of England is going to survive in a new era of higher inflation and with monetary policy under unprecedented political scrutiny. And that's why our goal has always been to try and shed some light on these stories so that you can better understand what's going on in the world around you. Unfortunately, though, many news outlets use this complexity and nuance to frame a story in a certain way, which is why I'm super excited to tell you about today's sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a very useful website and app which I use every day that lets you compare related articles in one place from thousands of sources around the world and across the political spectrum, with context about every source you're reading. For instance, take this story about the former Environment Minister's complaints about the government's climate apathy. Ground News tells me which outlets are reporting on this most, and in this instance, we can see that only 29% of articles come from right-leaning outlets. So if you only read from one side of the spectrum, you could totally miss it. It also allows me to compare headlines and stories by outlets, allowing me to get a fuller picture of what's really happening. And if I want to dive deeper into any of these reports, I can be taken to the story with just one tap, with Ground also providing reporting accuracy and bias scores for each outlet. Now, I have Ground on my phone's home screen, and I genuinely can't recommend them enough. So because of this, we've decided to offer a special 30% discount on Ground News' Vantage subscription. You can only get that discount by clicking the link below, so check it out and help support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.